So this article, I read about productivity in the news. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports productivity every quarter. Productivity fell 0.6%, and the way they measure it is kind of interesting. It's a quarter over quarter annualized figure. So the quarter over quarter change, if you annualize that, was negative 0.6%. And productivity can be member gateway. Exactly. The productivity is simple. It's just output of work per hour, which you can just think about GDP, say per hour worked by the workforce. And that measure is really important to everyone. And there's some, I'll wax a little bit philosophical on it for a second, but it's really important that we get more out of our workforce over time, over long periods of time. And that's the reason for the oh no's meme. When I was a kid, there were very few memes. We had to walk miles to school, and we had very few memes. Now there's a lot of memes, but oh no's was one of the biggest memes when I was a kid, or not even a kid, just 10 years ago. Oh no's was about all we had. And we'd often have a Z at the end of the oh no's, but enough about oh no's. The productivity is one of these things that really drives economies, and GDP can't really grow without it, because the number of hours people work is more or less the same. So if you think about why GDP grows, it's almost exclusively from productivity. So just think about that for a minute. It might blow your brain a little bit that when you measure growth, you're really just measuring productivity. There's some caveats to that, and price and inflation and things like that, but we'll talk about maybe at a later date. But it's sort of interesting how important productivity is. And if you think about why markets may not be zero-sum or negative-sum, as sometimes I say they are, productivity is the one reason they should be. Now, should productivity increase forever? Well, Buffett talked about this a little bit at the annual meeting, that if we didn't have productivity, and he basically had to answer the question as to why he partners with companies that fire people. And he sort of said, oh, well, if we weren't in his Midwestern Omaha shtick, which I do think is a shtick. He says, oh, well, if we didn't have productivity, we'd still be farming in the 1700s. And while that's true, there's also another perspective on it, which is that if we get really productive, when I was a kid, I used to read Ray Kurzweil's books about how we'd approach this level of accelerating productivity, also known as the singularity. And I want to go through that in a minute. So should productivity, as we get more tools to be even more productive, should that get logarithmic at some point and reach an asymptote and become exponential? I'm not so sure. We'll talk about that shortly. But ultimately productivity does matter a lot. So what drives productivity? Well, I did this, and this is a bit to make fun of the productivity figures that the media came out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that, oh my God, 0.6%, negative 0.6% is this big disaster, and that productivity needs a kick in the butt. So productivity has been low for several years, and I'll talk about why in a second, but you can't really look at a quarter of productivity. Productivity doesn't really work that way. You have to look at decades of productivity. So I did that, and I actually had to reverse engineer the annual, it's not too hard, the quarter annualized rate, and take it and make it an annualized rate, or the other way around, make it a true quarterized rate, and then I took an 8-quarter moving average and made it an annual rate again. So I did some transformations here, but this is what productivity, reverse engineering, aka dividing, but no, it's like a dividing, reversing an exponent, I guess, but anyway, the point is, here's the annual 8-quarter moving average annual rate of productivity over the last 60 or 70 years. And when I think of productivity, what I think about is these big moments of kind of, why do we go on, why can we extract, and the next slide will be really take this home, why are we able to extract more work per hour worked? And it's sort of a beautiful thing if you think about it. And the next slide will show how much work we've gotten out of the same amount of work. Humans have not worked any more or any less than they did in 1949. Maybe, in fact, we were working less. But the point is that we started out with things like computers and all kinds of plastics and other industrial advancements, satellites and memory and microprocessors. And these are all, remember, it looks like, what's important here is that not that you think about the trend in productivity. That is absolutely not important. And that's why I think, again, I see science writers and business writers who don't know anything about science and business, which is so painful to read this stuff, which is a little bit why I do this series, to try to explain what this stuff really means. Anything above the zero is good. Basically, any time this thing is above zero, it's good. And 2%, 1%, 3%, it doesn't matter really what the number is. And we'll talk about why in a second. But what's kind of interesting is these really big kind of things that happen once every 5 or 10 years. You can see the start of financial engineering. What I meant by that is the LBO. When LBOs started with the Drexel Burnham and Michael Milken LBO phenomenon in the 80s, companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan said, maybe we shouldn't be these boring banks, maybe we should actually do some cool stuff, and that actually is a form of efficiency, as are some other things that you may not sort of appreciate, like the medicines boom. What does medicine have to do with efficiency? Turns out a ton. Just things like Prozac made us more efficient. So you had these sort of like this big productivity nirvana with the internet, computing, some first-time medicines for a lot of different illnesses. And now we've had this kind of trend for the last 10 years that productivity sort of declined, if you will, but it really doesn't make sense to think of that way. I do think we're in for another productivity boom. Benedict at Andreessen Horowitz writes about how much autonomous vehicles are going to improve productivity. And if you read Adderall, if you read anything from this, I'm so happy you're spending an hour with me. But if you read anything, read Benedict's talk about or his blog about autonomous vehicles, because I think, in fact, it's so important. I think let me just pull it up here. Benedict Evans, not Benedict Cumberbatch. That's ben-evans.com, and there's this little blog, and it's called 10-Year Futures. And if you read this, I think it's great because it talks about how autonomous vehicles are going to change the way we live, sure, but from my perspective, I think about it as productivity and how much more work we can get done with the same amount of human capital. In other words, hours worked. We can actually produce a lot more. So I actually think I put down a list of kind of things that I think will improve productivity over the next 10 or 50 or 100 years. And so automated nutrition is a fantasy idea of mine that, actually the process of eating is going to basically disappear. And that we will eat food recreationally here and there for nostalgia's sake. But nutrition will actually become more of an automated process. And maybe I'll explain that later. Quantitative investing seems to be superior to non-quantitative investing. So I think that it's basically been relegated to a very select, very lucky few, and that might actually might actually explode and become something that everyone can get access to these high returns, which I think would make us more productive. It might also just create inflation. I'm not sure. Flying cars is up there. It's great. Hyperloop and other modes of travel are interesting. Brain-machine interface, you saw one video earlier. I'm not so sure I want my head sliced open to get one of those things, but it's kind of an interesting possibility. Machine learning and AI will be parts of all kinds of things in business, and I'm not as excited about it as everyone else is. But we'll see. Telemedicine is a very simple way that we can extend the great medicine boom we've had and actually start to address the 80% of the healthcare costs that are out there that drugs aren't a part of. Like physicians and hospitals, and I do think that being able to Skype your physician or Skype a Watson physician or something like that, some kind of AI physician, is something that could lower healthcare costs somewhat dramatically. I'm working on Google 2.0, which is my software company, Godel. You can actually go to sign up for I wouldn't call it Google 2.0 just yet, but you can sign up for a beta at godel.systems. So just go to godel.systems and you can fill out a form. If you fill it out with your LinkedIn, you're about 10 or 20 times more likely to get a beta version of Godel. So I joke that it's Google 2.0, but if you have a very long patience for an analogy, I think it's that's sort of the idea. Anyway, Drones and logistics will also be dramatically, I mean, that'll be a much bigger part of driving efficiency than anything else. 3D printing or teleportation, this is getting more into 50 or 100 years from now. Space exploration, time travel, I have some, these aren't just sci-fi things, I have some sophisticated thinking on this. Quantum computing, etc. The biggest one that I eventually will work on, I'm not trying to do my best Elon Musk impression here, but I actually think sleep is our biggest productivity time waster. If you think about all these things add to one part of the equation, which is productivity, but the productivity is, like I said, it's a quotient. So if you think about productivity, it's output per hour. Well, everything's focused on increasing output, but very few of these, maybe just one or two, are focused on how many hours do we work. And I actually think that the need for sleep, there's a video game called The Need for Speed. I should call it that. The need for sleep is arguably unnecessary, that we actually don't need to sleep at all. And that if I could invent a pill that would require us not to sleep, that those 8 hours of your day, literally a third of your life, is wasted. And if you think about it logarithmically, you actually are wasting quite a bit of your opportunity, and that with one pill, maybe taken once a day, you wouldn't need to sleep. I think that'd be kind of a cool invention. And again, not commercially maybe the greatest opportunity of all time, but from a productivity perspective, I'd put it up there with Windows 95 as to how much it would drive our help. Of course, we have a tremendous need for sleep. I particularly do, but if you could synthetically generate sleep through some biochemical process, if you look at BDNF or sharp wave complexes, it could be possible to actually induce some kind of rapid sleep process, and that would be quite a productivity booster. So why is all of this interesting? And why is like one blip in a quarter of productivity not important? Here's kind of a more sophisticated analysis of it. So if you actually take that quarterized, in other words, you de-annualize it into a quarterized process, you know, what I did is I drew these lines. So this is, you call it AUs or arbitrary units. So I started at 1 as the arbitrary unit. And what I did is I tried to figure out how much time it would take to go from 1 unit to 2 units. And it took 101 quarters. It was real data. It took 101 quarters, and you could divide by 4, what is that, 20, 25 years, to go from getting 1 unit of work, or $1 per hour, or whatever you want to call it, one arbitrary unit for every hour work to getting 2. And right now we're about 4 point something. And what I found was really interesting that this actually kind of obeyed a linear progression for the first couple of units. And then it started to move a little bit differently. And you can see the slope got quite a bit more sort of steep. And what's interesting, and this is really, really important, because I think this is what the even very sophisticated writers at the Wall Street Journal don't understand, this, is that productivity is something that is accruing constantly. And that I only have data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 1949, but if you think about inventions before 1949, telephony, you know, et cetera, productivity is actually maybe going logarithmic. And you can see just on this sort of shorter, it's 80 years of data, so it's not that short, but this shorter time frame, that these incremental inventions, the average of productivity at 2 or 3% is still, that's on top of prior gains. So this is really large boosts of productivity. So we only needed 46 quarters or 4 years to go from 3 units to 4 units, whereas, you know, that amount of increase, that quantum of increase, took 25 years some other period ago. And so, you know, we're on pace to take 80 quarters to go from 4 units to 5. Now, again, a lot of our inventions, quote unquote, in the last 5 or 10 years have been somewhat less clear that how productive they are. Things like Facebook and I don't know, other social media tools. They're certainly productive in some ways, and how they truly are productive may take many years to be seen. But I do think that they're useful to a certain extent. They're new abstractions of the internet, which isn't a new tool. So I think the VC community and some other smarter capitalists are right to start thinking about non-internet solutions. That what we've got left on the internet is actually pretty limited, and that we need to sort of start to transcend again. So those are some of my thoughts on sort of productivity and VC and tech and stuff like that. I hope you found it interesting.